Hi there, this is John Lebensold for KillerPHP.com, and today what I'm going to be doing is looking at how we can move our session variables and the management of session, which is technically a persistence mechanism, into the model. So in the last couple of videos we've been looking at a current user object, which is fine and dandy, but we've been also managing session, which isn't so neat, because it means that we're doing things like this user exists and is set session current user. So we're checking to see if a user exists, and then we're managing those parameters and variables all kind of in this way. So as a way of handling that kind of issue, we're going to be moving to a user set. So the first thing I want to do is I want to go to my index controller, and I want to just start by creating a new user. And I don't want to have to worry about session. We're going to move session into the model. So I'm going to take new KP models user, and I'm going to put it in the default action. So it's fine there, except we're going to get rid of all of this code. Don't worry, it'll come back. So I'm going to have this user equals new KP models user. And now I'm going to move that code into the user object in its constructor. So we created an empty constructor here. However, we're going to add some persistence mechanisms, some saving mechanisms in there. And it's going to be very simple. Basically, we're going to check if users isn't set, we set it. That way, whenever we create a new user model, we'll always have access to the user's variable, and it'll always be saved appropriately. Now, when we save parameters, we have to save them in session. We can't just save them and then nothing will happen. We actually have to not only set the parameters in the user object, but then we have to save them in this user's variable that we've set. So I'm going to create a variable here called keys set equals array. And also this has been, right now we're just sort of relying on the key existing, and if it doesn't, PHP is going to throw an error. So we're going to add a bit of robustness to our code here. So I'll say if property exists this key, we're checking to see if the property of a particular key exists. And then we'll assign it, and we'll also store it in the keys set variable as a key and a value. The reason being that I want to go through and I want to make sure that all of the users that I'm setting can have their session set or their session changed. So when I save parameters, I'm assuming that this is going to be an insert statement. However, we could also do this with update or delete or what have you. And if you're looking at something like Cake PHP or even the Zen framework or Symfony, then there's a lot of underlying architecture that will handle this stuff for you. So here if I say users, we've already got our set of users, so we just have to go to session and, oh, my bad. We want to make sure that we define session as an array up here. So even if it's in an empty array, it's still an array and we're not going to get any type issues. So we'll say users equals users. Basically we're grabbing it from session or from memory. And then we'll say users, and what this is going to do is it's going to add an indice, or it's going to add an element to that array, equals this. So what we're doing is we're passing in the assignment, this object, into the user's set. So if you think about this, here if I have first name as a parameter with Jane, then it's going to get set over here. And then down here, I'm going to take the instance of this class and I'm going to pass it into the collection of users that I'm getting from session. So I can have multiple users that are being collected up. And then after that, I'm going to save those variables. So I'm going to go back to session. So this is persistence. just like that. Lastly, so this is a very simple way of just doing insert. If I wanted to track which keys were set, then I could return that as the following, whichever keys were set. So I could say keys set, and then we would be good to go. So if I go back to my index controller here, so in the default action, if I just want to finish this up, because we have this idea of post back, I can just go user, save parameters, and pass in the request object. And what it's going to do is it's going to give me a list of all the keys that were set. And if I wanted to, I could say that those keys are being set, so I should probably echo that out to the view. So I could say this keys set equals. So just like in the last video where I was passing in a variable which was actually a function, I'm going to be using the same function for creating definition lists, but I'm going to use it to check which keys were set on a particular save or insert. So here, I'm going to say key set is equal to whatever this function is. So we'll call this render func equals this get definition list func. So we're getting this render function. We'll call this list render function. And then I'll do list render function. And I'm going to pass in the keys that were set. And then lastly, in my default.php, I'm going to say, put a header 2. The following keys were set. And we'll just echo this keys set. I go back to my index controller, that should be fine. So if I go back to the index of my app, so far nothing. If I put in John and I submit this, then I'll see that John was submitted and that it was set. Now let's say that I mistyped my form and I put in something here like, let's say phone, and phone wasn't defined as a property of my class. So if I were to go back here, and if I put in John and Lebensold and my address in Canada, and I hit submit, you'll see that the phone is not being set. And the reason the phone isn't being set for this particular example is because the property doesn't exist in this class. So we're getting a bit of validation as well, but the validation is all being kept in the model. So the model is protecting the data. Anyways, so with that working, and with our index controller being able to set keys and so on and so forth, we're going to turn our attention over to the welcome action, which now is starting to not make a lot of sense because we're doing a couple of things here. We're checking to see if the user exists, and then if the user does exist, so then we're rendering that user with this particular definition list function. But now we're dealing with multiple users that can be saved with the same form. So the first thing I want to do is I want to start looking at how I can do static variable checking. And I'm not interested in if a user exists, I'm interested in if users exist, if there are multiple users, if there's even one user. So let's start there. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to call the user object statically. And I'm going to say if kp \models \user and then double colon users exist. And then if they do, then for now, let's just say this users exist. So we're just passing in a string for now for this user. And else, actually, let's call this user count. And users don't exist. And here we will be able to figure out how many users exist. So I'll go back to users, or the user object, and we've only been creating functions that work on one particular user. But now we're going to start to define static methods, or static functions. And these are basically just regular old functions, but they happen to be defined or declared inside the namespace of that user class. So these do not interact with any of the protected properties here unless you specifically use the word self. So I'm going to create a public function here, but it's going to be a public static function, and it's going to be user exists. And what it will do, and this might seem a little strange, but it's going to create a new user object. And then what it'll do is it'll actually check to see the count. So we actually have to get the users, right? So we'll say user get all. And this will be users. And then we'll return if users equals, if count of users equals 0, then we'll return false. And else we'll return true. So now we have to create another function called getAll. And actually this can also be static. So we'll do that in just a second, and it's okay for one public static function to call another public static function, but it's not okay for a static function to call a non-static function, because a non-static function is referring to one instance of that class, and that's why we use the word this, because we're dealing with this version of that class. So I'm going to create another static function called getAll. So if we define a public static function called getAll, then we can basically return the user session. But we want to be careful, because if the user section is empty, then we want to return something else. In our case, we'll just return an array. So if it's not set, then we'll return an array. And if it is set, then it'll return the set of users. Now here, we can clean this code up a bit, and we can say users, or user, and then double colon, get all, and then do a count, and if the users are non-existent, then it'll return false, and else it'll return true. We can also use a ternary operator, and we can clean this code up as well. We can say return, and then I'm going to say count users equals 0. So this is the same thing. And in the case where it's true, we want to say false. And in the case where it's false, we want to say true. And this is exactly the same as writing this, except it's on one line. So if this condition is true, then we'll return false. And if this condition is false, then we'll return true. Just delete that. We'll go back here, and I'm going to use my web developer toolbar, which is free, and I'm going to delete the domain cookies. And we'll go back to the index controller where we're using this code, and it's in the welcome action. So I'll say index/welcome, and it says, uh-oh, we don't know who you are, please register. We're not actually using the word user count yet, so we need to pass that along. And this user exist should be users exist. And let's just delete that for now. Go back to the index controller, and I want to pass this variable to the view. So instead of just putting it in the if statement there, I'll just say this users exist, and I will put this users exist. And if users do exist, then I want to put in the count of those users. So I'll say count this actually we'll do KP models user get all, and we'll echo that. And then I'll go back to welcome.php, and I will say user count. And let's try that. So this is still going to fail. And if I register, hit save, go to index and welcome, then it'll say 2 users exist. So there you have it. We're doing insertion. It looks like things are working. I'm not exactly sure why we got 2 users. So we're going to have to look at that and see why we're getting that. It looks like for some reason my save inserted it twice. Saying users, so we're setting the keys, passing this into the session object. It's quite possible I just submitted the form twice. So let's delete the domain cookies. Index welcome. We don't have any users. Go back here, go back here. So every time we go to this page, it's always inserting users, even if they're non-existent yet. So we need to add a bit of validation to make sure that our requests are actually being posted back with something in them. Since every time we go to the default action, it's just passing in the request object, and it's just saving that to session, even if it's empty. So we need some minimum criteria here. And this is a good example of when the index controller should be validating what's coming from the view. So here we can say if request, and we know we're looking for 3 form elements, so I can say count is greater than 2. Then we can put all of this code in there. Else, we'll just say this keys set is nothing. So now if I go back and I delete my domain cookies, refresh this, go back here, and then if I put in John, hit submit, it gets set over here. If I go to index/welcome, then it'd say 1 users exist, which isn't very pretty, but you certainly get the sense of how we can dispatch requests, handle validation inside the controller, save that stuff in session, and then call on it in another action, which is kind of neat. So in the next little tutorial, what we're going to do is see how we can collect all this stuff up and then create the callback. And then following that, we're going to be looking at the observer pattern. Thanks for listening.